Thank you very much. My name is Ben Saratu. I'm a local Hungarian and member of the organization community, and I'm still very happy to see everyone here. How is Iram? Do you enjoy yourself? Still good, still fine. Okay, excellent. I will be chairing a keynote session by Natalie, and then we will have here in this room 3 more talk on machine learning mostly. But first, a 45 minutes talk from Natalie. He's from France, a statistician, and we will learn about using this similar data. So please enjoy the talk, Natalie.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. I first want to thank the organizer of this conference for the invitation, very nice invitation. I am very happy to be there here, even though I'm also probably more nervous than fully happy right now, but that will be better in 1 hour, I guess. Okay, so I am Nathalie Villa-Vialané. Don't try to pronounce my name. I think it's even worse than a Hungarian name. And I will talk today about learning things from data described by dissimilarity or similarity. So more precisely, I will focus on what I call relational data, but are data described by relations. What I mean by relational data is not the standard data that you are used to, so it's not individuals described by variables that are numerical variables or factors, but data that are entities or people or objects described by their relations to each other. So you can think about network or distance data and so on. And I will focus on unsupervised learning. So I will not try to predict something from this kind of data, but to try to extract information, relevant information from them. So it means using exploratory tools like visualization, clustering, or dimension reduction method like PCA. So I will try to explain the basic principles with which you can deal with relational data for exploratory analysis. So my talk will start with a description of a few projects in which I've been involved that were containing relational data, and I will try then to give a more formal setting of this kind of problem, so a bit of mathematical setting and statistical setting, even though I will try not to be too technical. And then I will describe 2 kinds of application of this kind of framework to hierarchical clustering and also to self-organizing map, which are related to packages in which I have been involved. Okay, and if I have time left, and I think I won't, I will describe how you can combine information using this kind of principles. Okay, so I will start with a few examples of projects in which I've met relational data. And the first one was during my PhD, where I was involved in a project with historians. And we were studying a big corpus of medieval documents that were collected during 3 centuries around the 100 Years' War. And this corpus contained more than 6,000 agrarian transactions that were describing lands being bought and rented by people. So all these transactions were related to a small village which is located in southwest of France and called Castelnau-Moratier, where you have a castle. And they have been preserved, which is very rare in France because of the French Revolution. Most of these documents have been destroyed now. They have been preserved because of a funny story that I can tell you during the coffee break if you'd like to. Okay, so this corpus has been recorded in a database by historians because you need to be an expert to model properly the data. And from it, we have obtained a network, which is a bipartite network with more than 17,000 nodes that are either individuals or transactions. And transaction was linked by an edge to to an individual if the individual was actively involved in the transaction, not only as a witness. So this is the first time I met relational data, and this was a graph. And we wanted to know if we were able to extract from it enough information to gain knowledge about the way the medieval society was organized in France using this network. Okay, on a similar field of application, I used also to work on a very different kind of data coming from a survey, also a French survey, Génération 98, which is a survey for people having graduated in 1908 that were monthly surveyed during 94 months. And we recorded for them their labor market status into 9 categories. So the data were categorical time series. And one of the questions that we had with this data was to cluster these career paths into homogeneous groups to extract the more typical way people having just graduating enter the labor market. So, of course, when you have the categorical time series, it's not that easy to know what career paths are similar or dissimilar. And as shown in this little picture, you can think of different ways of measuring the similarity between career paths. But basically, you can think about 2 main ways to do that. If you're using the chi-square dissimilarity, you emphasize the contemporary identical situations. And if you're using another kind of dissimilarity, which is called optimal matching or sometimes equidistance, you're looking at the minimum number of operations like deletion, substitutions, or insertion that you need to pass from one career path to another. Okay, so you're looking at sequences similarities rather than contemporary events. And then as I entered the INRA, which is the French National Institute for Agricultural Research, I started to work with biologists, and I started to work on next generation sequencing data, NGS data, that are data collected at different levels of a living organism, from the DNA sequence to gene expression, proteomes, metabolomes. And many of these data are also well described in a dissimilarity or similarity framework. I will show a few examples in the next slide. So the first example that you can think about is very closely related to the categorical time series I presented before. It's DNA barcoding. So when you have 2 DNA sequences, you can also use optimal matching distances to compute a kind of distance between the DNA sequence. And this is useful to classify your individual into different species or subspecies. So this is a very standard problem in biology. More recently, I also have studied more and more high-C data. So this is a very new kind of sequencing data in which you try to capture information about the 3D organization of a chromosome in the cell. As you may probably know, chromosome is densely compacted within the cell, and we know that when 2 loci of a chromosome and 2 loci or 2 loci or 2 different chromosomes are spatially close together, it has a function for the living organism. It means that one gene might regulate the other and so on. So IC data capture this kind of information, and it looks like a big similarity matrix. So you have any pair of loci in your genome, and for this pair of loci, you have the number of times the loci have been seen spatially close within the cell. So it is a count data, a big matrix of similarity data that are counts. And the third example of data in biology in which you met distances are metagenomic data. So metagenomics, you have maybe heard of it if you have heard of microbiota, which is a very popular kind of data in biology recently because it has been shown to be involved in many diseases. So metagenomic data are not restricted to microbiota. It can also be collected for ground samples or water samples and so on. So what is it? It's the collection of all the species that you can find in a sample and the counts of each of these species. So at the end, what you obtain is a big data with counts, a big matrix with counts. You have the samples, you have the species, and you have the number of times a species has been found in a given sample. So, okay, when you want to see if two samples are a bit alike, you can, of course, use a distance, a standard Euclidean distance between the counts of the species in the two samples. But it is actually a bad idea because species themselves are relations to each other. This is called phylogeny. So some species are closer from other species than to some other species than from other ones. For instance, we humans are closer to monkeys than to dogs. Okay, and if you can take this information into account, you more relevantly compute the resemblance and dissemblance between your metagenomic datasets. Okay, so now that I have explained what kind of data I want to learn from, I will explain the basic principle for exploratory analysis with this kind of data. And first of all, I will put a bit of notations and mathematics to explain how this kind of data can be represented in a mathematical point of view. So this data can be, as I said, Euclidean distance or non-Euclidean dissimilarities between my object of interest. So these are symmetric n times n matrix, which I will denote by D, with positive entries and a diagonal which is equal to 0. Or they can be something that you have maybe heard about before, kernels, that are symmetric and positive definite matrix, K, that measures a relation between n entities that can be arbitrary. So it can measure, for instance, a relation between nodes in a graph. And these kernels, because of the positive definiteness of the matrix, have an important property and feature. It's that they define an implicit Hilbert space and dot product in this Hilbert space. So more precisely, if you have a kernel matrix, I will try to use that. I said that before. I'm old-fashioned. I can't use that. Okay, so if you have a kernel matrix, you know that there exists a feature map and a Hilbert space in which your data can be mapped, and your kernel is exactly the dot product in this feature space of the images of your original data. So your kernel is basically only a dot product. Okay, the third type of relational data are networks or graphs that are groups of n entities that we call nodes or vertices that are linked by a relation that is potentially weighted, and this relation is usually called an edge. So again, this is a symmetric matrix. This matrix has positive entries and a diagonal which is null if you don't allow for self-loop. And finally, a more general way to have relational data is to account for similarities between n entities. And again, this is a symmetric matrix. Usually the entries are supposed to be positive, but it is not necessarily definite positive, so it is not a kernel. Okay. So now that you're lost in all this kind of relational data, I will say that there is many relations between these different types of data. So for instance, if you have a kernel, as I said, you have an implicit Hilbert space, so you also have a distance because you can compute the distance in the Hilbert space. So, okay, it's simple. A kernel, then you can have a distance. if you have a dissimilarity, even if it is non-Euclidean, you can compute a similarity, provided the fact that you are able to define a self-similarity. So this is what I call A of X, that can be set arbitrarily. And then you can compute a similarity from your dissimilarity. And if you have networks, you have a variety of kernels, for instance, that you can compute from this network that are, most of them are based on what we call the graph Laplacian, that has been shown to be closely related to the graph structure. So in summary, all these type of relational data are related to each other, and a useful simplification that I will use in the remaining of this talk is that is the framework Euclidean or not? If the framework is Euclidean, I will talk about kernel. So in kernel, you have an implicit Hilbert space, so you know how to compute dot product and distances easily. And if you're not Euclidean, I will talk about non-Euclidean dissimilarity. So this is the only two cases that I will cover in the remaining of this talk, because the others are closely related to these two ones. Okay, so what are the basic principles for learning from relational data? If you are in a Euclidean case, say you have a kernel K, you can rewrite all the quantities that you need in your statistical method with this kernel. How do you do that? You're using K's to compute distances and dot product in your feature space. This is called the kernel trick. And if you need to describe a non-observed element, something that is not in your original data set, like a center of gravity of a class or something like that, you're just using linear or convex combinations of the images by your feature map of the original data set. So you're using your original data set as a kind of basis to express all the other unobserved elements. And using these two principles, you can rewrite a number of algorithms. It works, for instance, for PCA, K-means, linear regression, and so on. Okay, so now, if you are in the non-Euclidean case, so you have a non-Euclidean dissimilarity D, and you have a framework also that is closely related to the kernel framework and has been introduced in the 80s by Goldfarb, and it is called the pseudo-Euclidean framework. And what it says is that if you have a dissimilarity, you don't have one Hilbert space, you have two Euclidean spaces. One is a positive Euclidean space, the other is a negative Euclidean space. And you can express your dissimilarity in terms of a difference between what happens in the positive space and what happens in the negative space. And so you can use the same two principles that were used for the kernel to rewrite almost all the algorithm in this framework. Okay? So I will talk about the first application, which is a simple one to constrain hierarchical clustering. So I suppose that you all know what are hierarchical clustering. If you don't, I've put a little image that illustrates it. Okay, so this is an application that has interesting properties in genomics. So we want to obtain a hierarchical clustering, not permuting objects that are given with a natural order. I will explain that better. Suppose you have your genome, your chromosome. You want to cluster together loci on the chromosomes such that you have only clusters with contiguous loci. Why is that interesting? Because we know that we have in the cell, in the chromosomes, what we call functional domains, also called TAD, that are domains on which the genes function together. So repress or activate each other's. Okay? So we want to find this functional domain, and since they are closely related to the spatial conformation of the chromosomes, we will use for that IC data. So IC data, as I explained before, is like a similarity matrix. So using this similarity matrix, we will apply constrained clustering, hierarchical clustering, to find the hierarchical organization of the chromosome within the cell. Okay? you have also other type of application in the genomic field, like finding haplotypes. Haplotypes are a group of genomic positions that are inherited together from your parents. And we are able to find this kind of haplotypes using a kind of correlation, which is called LD, between the genetic mutations that are observed in your DNA. Okay? So constrained hierarchical clustering can be used with IC data or LD. Okay, so this is something that we have implemented in the package HClust, so that performs hierarchical clustering. And using the principle that I have described before, this has been implemented for arbitrary similarities, or for kernels, or for arbitrary dissimilarities. So it extends a previous package that was called RIORA, that worked with dissimilarities. So it can be used at a large scale, for large-scale data set, to be able to be used at the genome scale, thanks to a fast implementation that is based on the fact that most of the data in genomic are sparse. You observe many zeros. And using these sparse properties, we were able to reduce the complexity of the original method that was at the square of n in time and space to something which is linear in n multiplied by h, where h is the length of a non-sparse band around the diagonal. Okay, so this is implemented in this package, which is fast. So in the package, you also have other features like wrappers for IC datasets and LD datasets to be used directly with biological data. We have also implemented model selection methods to be able to find where to cut the dendrogram efficiently using either an heuristic which is called the broken stick and something which is a bit more mathematically justified, which is called the slope heuristic. That has been studied by Berger and Massa. We also have other features like corrected dendrograms, because when you do constrained hierarchical clustering, sometimes you have weird dendrograms with reversals. So we have plots to correct that problem, and other nice plots to compare data with clustering, like this one. So this is an application to IC data. In the bottom of the figure, what you can see is the IC matrix, and in the top of the figure, you have a corresponding dendrogram, where the clustering found by the slope heuristic has been emphasized with tiny red rectangles. And so we performed that at the genome scale and found a constant average size, whatever the chromosome length, which was a good indication of the relevance of the model selection method, and a similar result for broken stick and slope heuristic. And what was interesting with this result was that we didn't lose most of information using only a sparse band of 1/10 of the data, because we have almost exactly the same clustering using only 1/10 of the data and the fast implementation. Okay, so this was the first application. I will now talk about the second application to self-organizing map. For those who are not familiar with this method, self-organizing map is a method that kind of performs clustering together with visualization. So it is a good method for exploratory analysis. So I will explain the basic of this method in a standard multivariate setting. Say you have a data set from RD, which is displayed on the left of the slide. And what you want to do is to project this data set into a grid that is made of units. So each data from your data set is affected to a given unit in the grid. So you have capital U units. And the grid itself is equipped with a kind of distance between units that is represented here by this shade of pink. And so that observations from your original space that are close together are also affected to close units on the grid. Okay? And another feature of a self-organizing map is that each unit is represented in the original space by what is called a prototype, which is a multidimensional vector in the original space. And the prototype for unit U is called PU. Okay, so how do we learn this kind of method? You have an iterative learning in which you alternate an affectation step, an assignment step, and a representation step. In the assignment step, you picked at random a data within your data set, and you affect it to its best matching unit, which is simply the unit with the closest prototype. And in the representation step, you update all the prototypes in neighboring units of this best matching unit. So the update is performed in something that looks like a gradient descent step, whereas it is not, but it is very similar in spirit to a gradient descent step. Okay, so this is the algorithm. Don't try to read it. It's unreadable. What I want to show you, writing the algorithm, is a modification that we do to extend it to the kernel or the dissimilarity framework. So now suppose in blue you have a data set from an arbitrary space which is not necessarily multidimensional. So say your data set are nodes of a graph, okay? And you can you can compare these nodes using a kernel. Okay, as I said, you need to express the prototype in the original data set, but the prototypes are not necessarily an observed node of your graph. So prototypes are expressed as a convex combination of images of your node by the feature map. Okay? So this is the second principle that I have explained before. And then you simply rewrite the assignment and representation steps using the feature space in the feature space. So you're using the norm in the feature space and the differences in the feature space, which is a Hilbert space. And this can be simplified using the kernel trick. So the norm can be expressed simply using the kernel, and the representation step can be expressed using the coefficients beta that can be seen as simple coordinates in the feature space with respect to the basis made by the original data. Okay, so this is exactly the same for the dissimilarity case, except that you have a simplification here, which is based on the dissimilarity, so it has not exactly the same form than for the kernel data, but it is, in spirit, it is the same. You do the same kind of thing. Okay, so this method has been implemented in the package that we call Sombrero. So in this package, you have stochastic variants of the sum. You have 3 stochastic variants. The first one is the standard sum for multivariate data. The last one, relational sum, is for relational data, as described previously. And you have a third variant, which is CoRESP, which is made for contingency tables and has been proposed by Marie Cottrell some years ago. We have also added a number of diagnostic plots. And we have specific functions in this package, which is designed mainly for relational data. We have specific functions to use the package with networks or graphs, and it can be used to obtain simplified representation of a big graph. So you're using the clustering of a graph and make a kind of metagraph in which each cluster is represented by a metanode, and metanodes are connected to each other according to the number of edges between the two clusters. So, okay, the package also contains vignettes that I hope are comprehensive. It's a bit of an overclaim, but I hope they are. And they are illustrated on 3 data sets corresponding to the 3 algorithms. And the relational algorithm is illustrated on a graph, which is a graph coming from the French novel Les Misérables, written by Victor Hugo. Okay, so we also have developed in the package a web user interface, which has been made, of course, with Shiny, and can be called with the function SombreroGui. It used to be available online on my server, but I'm a bit lazy, so I don't update it frequently, and it doesn't work at the moment. But the web user interface has been tasted on and approved by an historian, so I think it is simple enough. Okay, so maybe you have catch this information, but there's a few drawbacks using relational data. The first one is that when you're using relational data, you're using data that are described by a big matrix which has a dimension n square, where n is the number of objects that you're studying. So, of course, one of the main drawbacks of this kind of algorithm is that they are computationally very costly. For instance, for n object, the relational sum has a complexity of your order n square, which is large compared to the numeric version, which is linear in n, in the number of objects. So we have implemented in Sombrero an exact solution that has been proposed in this article to reduce the complexity of this method with an additional storage memory which is linear in the number of objects to deal with. And it gives exactly the same solution that the original method, but much more fast. There also another drawback that we have not addressed yet. This is a case when you have non-Euclidean data, and especially when the negative part of the data are strong. The learning algorithm can be very unstable because the gradient-like step sometimes is in a kind of saddle point, and so you have problems in learning the algorithm. So this is something that is not solved yet, and some authors have proposed to simply remove or transform this negative part of the data. If you are interested in this topic, I put the reference. It's called clip or flip, but of course the drawback is that you're losing information when doing that. Okay, so let's now go back to the applications. So we have used this kind of relational sum for mining the medieval social network that I've talked about before. And so we have obtained this kind of metagraph on the right part that we have found nice because it has nice relations with respect to space and time. So to the dates of the contracts and to the places of the contracts. And also it emphasizes leading people who are people in small cluster that links larger clusters. And it has also helped to identify problems in the data set. For instance, yes, I will do that. This guy here is actually not a guy, it's two guys that have the same name. So it has been used by historians to correct their database. Okay. So we were almost satisfied with the result, but we still had big communities that were still too complex to be comprehended by themselves. So we pushed forward the analysis, but this is another story that I won't tell today. So relational sum also works well for DNA barcoding. I'm sorry for the pie chart, which is just horrible. Okay, so relational sum is also useful for DNA barcoding analysis. We have used it with a data set of the species Abstraptes fulgerator, that are butterflies. To identify subspecies in this data set, and found a perfect clustering, identifying even a very probable label error in the orange cluster in the middle of the map on one sample. And in addition, what you have when using this kind of method for DNA barcoding is that you have information about the relations between the species. So these species, pink and green, are closer to each other than from the species, the subspecies purple on the top left part of the map. So this is a typology more than just a simple clustering. So it has also been used to obtain also a typology for school-to-time transition, so the career path, using the distance between 12,000 categorical time series, career paths, and we have found an interesting typology. Well, at least I don't know if it's interesting, but it's relevant, because on the top right side of the map we had fast access to permanent employment, whereas on the bottom left side of the map we have almost permanent unemployment. So this helped to identify a convenient typology of this career path. So I still have 10 minutes. So I will cover this last topic, which is how to combine relational data in an unsupervised setting. So what I mean to explain here is when you're looking at the same samples but with different point of view, it is interesting to combine them to end up having a global overview which is closer to just the single view provided by each of the data sets. So it's like this blind man looking at an elephant problem. Okay, so to illustrate this part, I will talk about this very beautiful data set, which is a Tara Oceans data set. It is coming from an expedition during the years between 2009 and 2013 that was co-directed by Étienne Bourgeois and Eric Karsanti. And very large data sets have been collected that contain many metagenomic data sets from different samples of different ocean waters around the world. These data sets contain bacteria metagenomics, viruses metagenomics, and other kind of animals metagenomics. And as I said at the beginning of this talk, the similarities between each metagenomic data set is well captured using phylogenetic-based distance. Okay, so more formally, the problem is this one. Imagine that you have different data sets that can have very different types, graph, numeric data set, phylogenetic information, and so on. And you want to know how to optimally combine them to obtain a global overview that is more relevant than each of a single overview. So the method that we have chosen passed by transforming all these data sets by a relevant kernel that well captures the similarity relation between the samples from one point of view, and to combine all these kernels into the same object using a convex combination of the different kernels. So this is a very standard way of working. This has been done since years in a supervised setting, except that in the supervised setting, you have a target, you have something to use for prediction to calibrate your beta, so your different coefficient, to know which data set should be favored instead of the others. So in the unsupervised setting, you don't have such a target, so you have to use different ways to combine this information. So this has been implemented in the R package mix kernel, and I will briefly explain how this works. So we have used two kinds of framework. The first one is called the Statis-like framework. It is based on Statis, which is a method developed by L'Hermier des Plantes in the 70s. That is based on the computation of similarities between kernels using the Frobenius norm and the Frobenius dot product. And using these similarities, you try to find the coefficient beta such that the combined kernel is the most similar in average to each of the kernel. Okay? So this gives you coefficients beta. And the thing is that using this correlation matrix, it's very simple to solve this problem because it is given by the first eigenvector of the similarity matrix. So this kernel can be seen as a consensual kernel, the kernel that is the closest in average to all the other kernels that you have. We also have another solution which aims not at being consensual but at preserving the most something that we can call the original topology of the data. And it's similar to a previous work that was designed in a multidimensional setting. So our framework is a bit more general. So the idea is to have a proxy of the local topology of the data in the original space, and to have a proxy of the topology of the data in the feature space. So in the original space, we simply use nearest neighbors graph and obtain from them an adjacency matrix that weights the number of times two samples are seen close together within one of a different view. And the feature space geometry is measured by the dot product in the feature space between your combined kernel for the observation xi and the combined kernel or feature map for all the observations. So you have a vector using this feature space geometry of dimension n for all the observation. So this gives two versions, a sparse version and a non-sparse version. I won't comment on these horrible equations, but the idea is to have in the feature space what you had in the original space and that you have captured with this local geometry information. On the optimization point of view, I will let that for another time. I will go back to application to Tara Ocean dataset. So what can we learn using that with Statis? So with the first approach, you can use the correlation between the different kernels to obtain information in on your different data sets. So here what we learn is that Psychen, which is one of the metagenomic data set, is closer to the small size organisms than to the large size organism, and that was good news because it is confirmed by biological knowledge of previous work in that domain. So we have combined all the information coming from this dataset together using the second framework, where we were aiming at preserving the global geometry of the dataset, and I've used a permutation strategy to extract the important species that were the most relevant to explain the different the obtain the projection of a dataset using a kernel PCA, and we have found some important facts that haven't been described before, like the fact that this Rhizaria abundance strongly structure the difference between samples in the different oceans. Especially, they differ. They differentiate waters from the Arctic Oceans and the Pacific Oceans. Okay, so this is the end of my talk. I still have 2 minutes for two personal communication. The first one is that I want to thank all my collaborators. So the people from the SAM laboratory in Paris, Jérôme Mariette, who is at the INRA and has made a PhD under my supervision, and my colleague from the Institute of Mathematics de Toulouse and from the Evry laboratory, and also Google Summer of Code, who has funded an intern that has helped us develop HCLUST. And the second personal communication is that I don't want you to miss a user that will be held in Toulouse next year, and we are all waiting for you there. I hope you will be all there, and I will be happy to welcome you in Toulouse, France, next year. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Natalie. I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience. So if somebody wishes to ask a question, please raise your hand so I can see. Do anybody raise the hands? Okay, I don't see any questions.
It's just after the lunch. I know you're all doing a nap.
Okay. We're definitely looking forward for next year visiting France for
Okay,
User.
thank you.
And just short announcement. Okay, some more applause, always welcome.